Hi everyone, and welcome back to our discussion on the empath leader. Before we dive in, please remember to like and subscribe so I can keep creating this content for you. And also keep in mind that this isn't necessarily for people who are leaders. Maybe it's for people that are looking to become leaders or people that just want to understand more about leadership. Today I want to take some time to discuss some trends in the workforce that have come relatively recently and why I think it's going to take empath leadership and a different eye to the future before things get resolved. There's been a lot of generational grievances of late, and I think we all know what I'm talking about. It seems like it kind of started around 2016 or so, but where it first really became prevalent was right around the Great Resignation towards the end of COVID, when it became clear that this generational divide was really making it into the workforce. The sad thing is that, as if we don't have enough things to keep us divided already, we had to come up with one more. And that's this generational grievance between the millennials and the boomers and the Gen Zs and the Gen Xs. Let's take a look at this through historical glasses and see why this is there in the first place. So the way it started was with researchers taking a look at these different age brackets, arbitrary age brackets, and how their relationship to technology shaped how they grew up, how they worked, and how they saw their futures. I mean, if you think about it, right? People from the boomer generation, figure the 1940s and forward-ish, remember a time when there was no internet, when you couldn't just go online and look up information, when there were no Zoom calls, when technology didn't come at such a rapid pace. Now contrast that kind of experience with someone who always grew up having computers and phones around. Millennials are roughly 1980 to 1996-ish. And that generation has a completely different relationship with technology than people that were older. And even within that generation, right? Someone born in 1980 with the Atari and the Commodore 6000 or whatever that computer was, they're going to have a completely different experience than someone from later in that generation that probably doesn't remember what it is to not have some kind of smartphone around. So yeah, these have created differences in these people, but is it worth categorizing them over? Here's the crux. Because the younger people grew up with technology as an instant thing, which hadn't been experienced by generations prior, and this shaped who they were and are, this created a certain amount of intellectual disconnect between them and the older generations. Not only does this have impact on what's happening now, but it has impact on who these leaders will become. As we've discussed, to be empathic is to meet someone at the emotional level, human to human, and not just the cognitive level. Yeah, I get what you're saying. So in order to better understand these groups, we first need to approach each with empathy and an understanding of who they are and why. But if we're going to relate to people on a human level, why put them into categories at all? So let's start with this presupposition of these categories and why they're there. This is the problem with issues like this. They all place people into groups based on some perceived arbitrary characteristic, like age. Even these age groups aren't necessarily the same depending on which scale you're looking at. Whenever people are categorized in any fashion, whether by race or gender or religion or shoe size or taste in hats or age, it creates a separation between people, which can, in turn, create a competitive, unnecessarily competitive environment. Does anybody here remember the Dr. Seuss book about the star-bellied Sneetches? Right? The Sneetches, they were birdie-looking things that some had stars on their bellies and some didn't. And the ones that had stars on their bellies decided that they were better. And so those Sneetches had their best beaches. Remember this? Because of a star, because of something completely arbitrary, but it set them apart. Sometimes everything we need to know really was in our children's books, but it's just as arbitrary to base these categorizations on whether you have a star on your belly or not as what year you were born. One generation says they're better for X reason, and the other says they're better for Y reason. But in the end, this one has stars on their belly and this one doesn't, and it's just as arbitrary. They're separated and competitive for no reason at all. This shows very real social implications with younger generations because they're showing that they're not willing to just take what the older generation says they should. And this is a good thing. Both have important knowledge and experiences to give, which is why I would, first and foremost, encourage everyone to think for themselves and not just take what they give you, whoever they are. Just because we've all been categorized, and make no mistake, we all have, doesn't mean we need to stay that way. We can think outside the box and think for ourselves and say, that's part of who I am, but that's not all of who I am. It's not even most of who I am. In my personal opinion, this is one way in which I believe the tolerance and acceptance of younger generations could be their biggest asset and really help everyone societally. But that's another video. The younger are also at a disadvantage because the older generations are entrenched. They are in the leadership positions, they are in the power positions, and it does create a differential. However, these younger generations have made it very clear with the Great Resignation and quiet quitting and minimal Mondays and coffee badging and the friction going on over remote work that they're not really willing to just kind of roll over and take what they're given because they're told they should. And this is good. We should be questioning the status quo. We shouldn't just take it because it's there. The problem with categorizing people based on an arbitrary trait is that it does several things which aren't necessarily helpful. First, it compresses the members of that group, meaning that it makes them more one-dimensional. So you only see one or two things that label them as part of that group, and everything else gets dismissed. The second is that it creates stereotypes around those groups. So people are lumped together based on a set of perceived attributes that in no way actually fit every single member of that group. This stereotyping in turn causes discrimination, which favors certain categories over others. We all know what happens with discrimination. So what happens if this stereotype is based on something that's false to begin with, like saying that all Gen Z are lazy and don't want to work, or all boomers are rigid, resistant to change, and technological Neanderthals? This is why stereotypes are false. But we do it anyway. And we'll talk about that because there is a certain biological basis in it that we need to be aware of so we don't fall victim to it. It also treats the categorical structure like it's unmovable. I can't change my age. I can't change my year of birth. So I'm part of this group no matter what. It's fixed. Here's the thing. We as humans are made to categorize things. We were given these big old brains that actually take a lot of energy and calories to run. And anyone who's gone into a brain fog because they haven't had enough to eat can testify how much energy these brains take. So because they take so much energy, they want to categorize, simplify, and process the complex and changing world as efficiently as possible. It's what we're biologically made to do. Think of it like a mental shortcut that we're not even aware we're doing. However, because you are now aware of it, you shouldn't be able to use it as an excuse. Why fall victim to your mental biology if you understand how it works? So if we know we're going to do it, is there a correct way to categorize? I would argue not really, but if things are going to be categorized, they have to satisfy two criteria. The first is that it has to be valid. So for the sake of argument, which we've already said was arbitrary, if a person's birth date falls between this year and this year, they're in this category. So by that criteria, we could say this is valid for the sake of argument. The other criteria that needs to be met, however, though, is it useful? And this is where it gets sticky. It can become useful in a broad sense, in that now we can understand why different people of vaguely similar ages relate to technology in a certain way. But is it actually useful as far as to say, well, no millennials want to work, they just all want to hang out with their avocado toast? We've all heard this, right? Is that useful? Is that categorization useful? It's not. And here's why. To categorize people by age causes divisiveness instead of open discussion, and it causes competition between groups where there should be collaboration. It is completely useless and actually creates harm. In essence, this categorization can be summed up as useless for 4 main reasons. It causes compression of the members, treats them as more alike than they actually are. It causes amplification of differences between members of different categories, so that each category looks like it's more different from the others, when in reality they're more alike than different. It's a false illusion. Because of this, people naturally discriminate, favoring certain categories over others, and we all know discrimination just turns out badly. This in turn causes us to fossilize these categories, which means we treat them like they're unchangeable. But if the categories are arbitrary to begin with, then of course they're changeable. None of that holds true. Finally, as a bonus reason why this doesn't work, it's well known in statistical circles that categorization can introduce bias, which in turn brings inefficiency into statistical estimates and can render them invalid. In essence, it doesn't work and gives misleading information. Period.